Excuse me, Gagan.
Yeah.
We are starting the recording now.
Hey, thanks, Sharath. Thank you so much. Cool. The quick agenda for this is a quick intro, as we always do, a quick case study of a player, interesting data-backed trivia, which probably would have not seen before, and hopefully make you think. Then we have Greg, who will talk about topic, the power of the mind, and then we have open house. Really, guys, request as it's a discussion forum. Last time we also had some very interesting discussions. Greg has specifically mentioned that while he can talk, but he would love to hear also other people's point of view and so on and so forth. So please do share thoughts, and if you have any questions between, please don't keep the formality that at the end of it only let's have a discussion, right? So let's make it as interactive as possible. Cool. Thank you so much. Navneet, next slide, please. So this is one player who's obviously, as I mentioned before, we do not share details of any individual player, but one player who playing for international team, represented in the World Cup. This was just 6 months before the World Cup, and something which we have discussed here is that playing in line with behind the ball, behind the intended direction of the shot. So what was happening, his coach, who's again a former international legend, West Indian player, and he was trying to tell him that it's during the back lift, it's too bottom heavy, and it's very cocking it, very holding it very hard, and it was not getting it. You straight back, he saw this, and he actually said it in his in Hindi, and by the way, he's not an Indian player, that mera bat goal bana raha hai. My bat is making a circle, and on offside play, it's having a much longer distance and much lesser behind the line, if you will, during the offside play, which is why he's not getting the power. And he made few reps, few changes, I think 4 or 5 days in December when they were here in India. And obviously it's not there, but he really could get it more behind the line. And the difference was a 29% shift in bat speed and impact speed, right? Again, few levers I think most of you talk about, but you now have data to back it up that actually a lever can actually make a huge difference. Move on, please. Thank you. This was interesting, and Nav came up with this. He's a sports analyst, chief sports analyst at Straight Bat, and he said that he was learning that people not aligning their game to their match practice, and he said, let me do some analysis. What do people do when they're playing a bowling machine, when they're playing in nets with sidearms or bowlers, and when they're playing match, right? This is across good set of players, guys. So the sample set is not a problem. So elite, I mean, people who have played at a state level and above, right? We're talking about them. Elite batters around the world, around the globe, yeah, have 10 degrees wider bat angle when they're playing in nets compared to that of bowling machine, and 16 degrees wider in matches. So definitely one can say, and there is a wisdom of crowd, which I'm sure everybody would have heard about. When you have data from good amount of sample sources, they tend not to lie. And this hypothesis, again, I think, which we discussed last time around, that match versus game, are we keeping the mindset of the game when we are practicing? I think something which Greg will also talk about during his discussion. Data backs it up, saying that there's a very different, again, there's no right or wrong. It's just that it's very different. It's not consistent. Yeah. And again, aberrations like whom you're playing, all that is out of the window simply because there is huge amount of data across players. This is not very few samples. These are thousands and thousands of shots, right? So it cannot lie. Cool. Just something for, which I thought will be interesting for you guys to think about and why this is happening. Yeah. I'll leave it at that. And probably if in the end we want to have discussed this, that would be also awesome. Next slide, please. So I hand it over to Greg. Thank you again, Greg. Over to you.
Thanks, Gagan, and hello to everyone. Great to see you all back on the forum. I think this is developing into something that will be of great value to the game of cricket, not only to us, but to all the people that we interact with should be good. Now that you've all settled down, I'm going to ask you all to stand up and leave the room. You know, I notice some of you have already got a drink, but go and get yourself a glass of water, or pretend to get yourself a glass of water and come back. I'd like to start the discussion after you've done your little trip to the kitchen.
Ah, that's interesting. 1 second.
Let me know when people are back, Gagan.
Yes, will do. And water, I think, is just figurative, right? You can get any drink what you want, depending on your time of the day, right?
Depends on the time of the day, obviously.
Awesome.
Do we have the majority of people back, or?
I think a few who are, let's probably wait for 30 seconds or 20.
Yeah, okay.
Cool, shall we? Yeah, I see people coming.
Would anyone like to tell me what they were thinking about while they were doing it?
I was inquisitive. Hi, this is Sairaj.
Hi, Sairaj.
I just inquisitive as to what is going to unfold once I get back.
Okay. Well, despite what it says in the cartoon there, your mind, I'm not messing with your mind, or I'm not trying to mess with your mind, but did anyone think about how they got out of the chair and walked off out of the room?
No.
No. I'd suggest nobody did. And it just shows you that much of what we do is done in the subconscious mind, and it doesn't matter what you're thinking about, whether you were wondering what the whole exercise was about, or whether you were thinking about the shopping that you were going to do later or tomorrow. 95% of our day is spent in the subconscious mind, because most of the programs that we have, we've grown up with, certainly the movement programs, but not only the movement programs, but our mental programs, our thought programs are generally ones that we learnt very early in our life, usually in the first 7 years of our life. And they could be, you know, not only how to walk and talk and all of those things, but what we think of ourselves, how we've got used to living in a family, living in a community, the rules of life and so on. Many of those things are learnt before the age of 7. And what you think about yourself is also developed at that stage of your life. So we've all seen players, we've all seen people with a lot of talent who've never been able to make it, and often they are self-sabotaging based on the programs that they've grown up with. And in cricket, we rarely talk about the mental side of the game, and yet we know that all of the best players through the history of the game have been the best thinkers, the best decision makers, and the ones that generally have a routine that they work with religiously. And that's because if you don't put something positive or at least neutral in your mind, then all of the negative stuff that you've learnt from your experiences through life and your interactions with other people, whether it be coaches, parents, school teachers, siblings, or peers, can interfere with what you do on the cricket field. So I think that I go back to, again, what we do in our preparation for a game of cricket is really important. whether it's with young players, whether it's with senior players. And I've played with and against, and I've coached players at a high level who I'm sure have no plan of how they're going to go about their daily activities, whether it's preparing for training, whether it's preparing for a match, whether it's in the middle of a match while it's waiting to go into bat, whether they're in the field preparing to bowl shortly. A lot of what they do is just purely reaction to what's happening around them. They're not following a definite plan of what they want to happen. And it's pretty much proven with all the research of the mind, as I say, if you don't put something in there that's positive and you don't prepare to succeed, then you better prepare to fail, because it's likely that you're more likely to fail than you are to succeed. So any success that a player has in that situation is generally by accident. It's not something they're going to be able to sustain, because they don't know what they did right on the good days, and they don't really know what the difference is between the good days and the bad days. We've talked about game sense training, and I know that some people worry about game sense training because they think that there's no coaching involved, that you just put on the game, you let people go and play, and that's it. That's very far from it. Game sense training is actually very demanding on a coach, because the coach has to really prepare for those training sessions with whatever is coming up in mind, whether it's a game, whether it's a series, whether it's whatever format it is, whether it's at home, whether it's away. And again, I know that the very best players prepare long in advance of not only games, but tours. And if now you can go on to the next slide for us. You know, there are two of the very best modern day players, and they have very definite plans for every day, almost every minute of every day, whether it's preparing for a training session or whether it's preparing for a tour. And both those clips are taken from interviews that these two guys have done. And Steve talks about his routine, his physical routine before every ball. You know, he touches his right pad, he touches his left pad, he adjusts his box, he taps the bat once between his feet, then a couple of times behind his feet. Then he's ready. You know, that has reminded his subconscious that he's in a contest and the action is about to start again. In the interview that Virat did, he talks about preparing for a tour, and he was talking months out from the tour. He was visualizing the bowlers that he was going to be playing against. He was visualizing the conditions in which he was going to be playing, and he had a plan. They both have a plan, and all very good players and very good teams have a plan of how they're going to prepare, as I say, whether it's for a training session, whether it's for a game. I think one of the best examples that we can have of somebody who probably didn't have a plan, if we can go to the next slide, Nab. You will all remember Darryl Cullinan batting against Shane Warne and the difficulties that he had. And I don't know whether you've seen it, but I've seen various interviews with Darryl talking about that period, and I've seen interviews with Warney who talked about that period and bowling to Darryl, and just how much confidence he had going in to bowl against Darryl, because he knew that he didn't have a plan and that he was worried about Warney's bowling and whether he would be able to pick the flipper in particular. It really discombobulated him mentally, so much so that he was so disoriented mentally that he actually didn't see the ball leaving the hand. So again, if we're not encouraging players with the way we set up our training sessions to work on their plans and their mental routines as much as the physical activity of hitting the ball and bowling the ball and fielding sessions, then we're really not teaching them the whole game. We're not giving them a chance to develop skills to be able to play the whole game. And we all know that cricket is much more than an exercise in batting and bowling. The game really is an exercise in problem solving. The bowler initiates the action, the batsman reacts to it, tries to answer the question that's been asked of him by the bowler. Then the bowler has to react to what the batsman has done to him. So, the preparation for these games and for training session has to start long before the actual sessions. And as I said, the game is an exercise in problem solving. So if we don't include problem solving in our training sessions, then the chances of players improving their decision making and their ability to be able to solve those problems disappears fairly quickly.
Can I ask you a question? Sorry.
Yes, mate. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Greg, in this, and you started with the conscious and the subconscious being the programmed, right? The first 7 years, I think you said, right? So,
yeah.
What would Tradell do differently if he has to do this in terms of preparation? I mean, how are you training your mind then? I mean, for this, not because he's seeing a pink elephant, right? The pink elephant is warning, right? He's not seeing the ball,
yeah,
right? So,
yeah. Look, I think it's difficult. There weren't too many warnies for him to be able to bat against in practice, and that was one of the issues, because obviously that was something that really undid him mentally. But I think if we can set up our training sessions in a way that the players, depends on the format obviously, but where they normally bat, what their role is in a game can be reenacted even in a net session. There's no reason why you can't set up a training session to mirror a 50-over game, for instance. Have the bowlers that would bowl at the start of the innings bowling to the batsman that would start at the start of the innings, and those who are going to be batting in the middle order and the death, and bowlers who are going to be bowling at the death, and so on. It would have been very difficult for Tradell to build up immunity to Warney, but the only way that he could have done it was through visualization. And again, I don't think we talk about visualization very much in relation to getting better, but some of the best training sessions that I had, and I know talking to to some of the better players through the years, some of the best training sessions they had were in their bedroom as they were going to sleep, just visualizing themselves batting against particular bowlers. And that's something that Tradell could have done if he'd been aware of it. I'm not sure whether he was aware of visualization as a technique to use to develop his batting, but that's something that would have been very helpful to him. So whether a coach or a sports psychologist or somebody could have worked with him, maybe it was up to him to try and find a way to improve his chances of success about Warney, because he obviously spent a lot of time visualizing, but I would suggest that from the outcomes, the visualizations that he was having is of Warney getting him out. And the sad thing is with these subconscious programs is that if you're thinking about something else, they will be running the program. Like when you guys went to get your glass of water, you would have been thinking of various things other than walking to get out of the room and go and get the glass of water. So immediately the mind goes to the subconscious mind and runs the program. It also runs that program that you've learned about, you're no good at this or you're no good at that. And I would suggest that Tradell was running that program pretty regularly. So he would have needed to be training something that was going to be more positive, talking to himself about watching the ball. You don't change those subconscious programs unless you do a lot of work on it. And, we talk about, batsmen and bowlers grooving their hitting and their bowling, but we don't talk about players grooving their thinking. And if you want to change some of those subconscious programs, not least of all from a confidence point of view, then that's something you need to practice just as much as your physical game. And again, we don't set up our trainings and our preparations for the game with that in mind. And again, the game's more than batting and bowling. Fielding is something that I'm sure the fielding coaches that are online would love to have a lot more time with players working on different aspects of their fielding. Rarely do you get enough time to do the sort of training that you want to do. But again, this is something that players can do. And I'm sure the better ones do a lot of practicing their fielding in their mind. I know Ricky Ponting was one who was very good at visualizing himself fielding, particularly his ring fielding. He spent a lot of time preparing himself mentally to reach the standard that he got to in his career. Can we move on to the next slide, Nav, please? As I've said, the preparation starts days in advance. If a player turns up to the game or even to a training without having prepared themselves and without having a plan in mind of what they're going to do, then they're probably going to fail the test. If you walk into an examination without having opened the book, then you have every reason to be nervous because there's a good chance that you're not going to pass the exam. And sadly, we let players turn up to training and turn up to games without really having opened the book, without having thought about, what they want to achieve in their training. You've got the different formats, obviously. So what type of format are you going to be playing in next? So how am I going to train? What things do I need to get better at? What role or roles am I likely to be playing with bat, ball, and again, in the field is really important. We can go on to the next slide, Nav, please. I know from my own point of view, having played against, some of the great West Indian teams in history, and particularly some of the best fast bowlers in history, these guys, not only were they fine bowlers, they, generally bowled at a good speed, but they were very clever bowlers. They also worked on a theory, and I'm sure this was something that not only Clive Lloyd worked out, but they bowled around about 12 overs an hour, and 3 or 4 balls an over were going through shoulder to head height. So if you faced half the balls, you had 6 overs in the session to score runs, and if half those balls were going through head height, you had around about 3 overs a session to make runs. So if you couldn't score off their less than good balls, you weren't making many runs. So if you didn't have a plan and you didn't have routines that you could follow, your chances of success against a group like this was pretty much zero. And if you got caught up in the scoreboard, got focused on the fact that, we've only scored 12 runs in the last 10 overs, or you'd only scored 3 or 4 runs yourself in the last 10 overs, panic was likely to set in, and all of a sudden you start trying to play shots that were never on. So that preparation was very important, and I found visualization was really important against this group. I use it against all bowlers, but particularly against this group, just to give me some chance of being ahead of the game. I think most players go into a match and they're behind the game before the game starts because they haven't prepared themselves properly for what's coming. They haven't thought about the different angles from each bowler. All of these guys were right-arm bowlers, but they were very, very different bowlers. Obviously, Joel Garner with his height was extraordinary. I'd never faced anyone from that height before. And in fact, one of the things that I judged length on was the angle it left the bowler's hand. Well, everything that left Joel's hand the first few times I batted against him looked like it was going to be short. And regularly it would hit you in the foot. So all of a sudden I had to rewrite the software for batting against Joel Garner. And again, I didn't have Joel Garner to practice against. So the only way I could practice against Joel Garner was in my mind, in a quiet moment, sitting in a dark room generally, not with padded walls, but sometimes it would have been helpful if they had been padded, I'm sure, because it was challenging mentally. But Colin Croft, who's the second one from the back, Crofty used to deliver the ball from wide on the crease and, came over his ear. I mean, he was delivering from wide mid-off. So again, getting used to that angle was something that I wasn't going to get against any of our bowlers in the nets. And obviously you're not going to ask some of your bowlers to practice like that if that wasn't the way they bowled. Michael was one of the quicker bowlers that I faced, and Andy was probably one of the cleverest bowlers that I faced, with a real variety of deliveries. And again, I survived against these guys largely on the ability to visualize in between training sessions and in between games, getting training sessions that were, much better probably than a physical training, because the only place I found that I could have a perfect training session was in my mind, where I batted against these guys with my eyes closed. I could see them running up, and it's not 3D color, it's only an impression of what the bowler is. But if I close my eyes now, I could see Joel Garner running up to bowl. I've done it so often, I could still do it. But seeing the sorts of shots, thinking about the angles that these guys were going to be providing, you showed that clip at the start of the straight bat, and hitting into the line of the ball. The importance of hitting into the ball was something that I worked a lot on in those visualization sessions. So again, if we don't train the mind along with the body, then we as coaches are not going to get the results we wanted, and the players that we're working with aren't. Nav, if you could move on to the next slide, mate, please. Yeah. I think the thing that I learned, and one of the things that I've tried to work with players on, is that they need to play their game one ball at a time. You don't face 6 balls in a row or 6 balls at once. You've only got to play one ball at a time, and it's not hard to concentrate for one ball. And if you can concentrate for one ball, you can concentrate for 1,000 balls. And that was something that was really important to me, particularly in that period against the West Indians. If I couldn't bring my focus down to playing one ball at a time, I would get caught up with the pressure of the scoreboard, with the pressure of the fact that we'd lost wickets, we were losing wickets at the other end, whatever it happened to be. And really, once players understand that they've only got to play their career one ball at a time, or as a bowler, bowl one ball at a time, it really does change the way you go about your training and the way that you go about playing in a game. One of the best examples I can think of as a coach was Srishant playing for India in Johannesburg against South Africa back in 2006. Sri was a young, fast bowler, very emotional character, very, very talented bowler. He probably was the best exponent, one of the best exponents of the fast outswinger that I'd seen. But Sri was a very creative character, and he wanted to bowl bouncers, he wanted to bowl in-swingers, he wanted to bowl slower balls, and he would run up and bowl 6 different balls and over. And Johannesburg, through history, has been one of the best grounds in the world to bowl fast on. And I knew that Sri was going to be a very important bowler for us in that test match. So for the 3 days training before that test match, I stood at the top of his mark with him at training, and we just worked on his mental routine and his ability to bowl one ball at a time. And each time he came back to his mark, all I wanted him to do for this test match was to bowl fast, full outswingers. I didn't want him to mess around with slower balls, bowl the odd bouncer. Don't worry about the in-swinger, because his in-swinger was nearly 10 kilometres, I think about 8 kilometres an hour slower than his best outswinger. And for 3 training sessions in a row, I stood at the top of his mark and said, what are you bowling this ball, Sri? Fast, full outswinger. Good. I said, and we talked about it, you know, obviously before and after training and leading into the game. And I said to him, I don't care what happens to the last ball. I just want you to go back and bowl another full, fast outswinger, just hitting the knee roll, which is going to be around about the top of off stump. And it was probably one of the most impressive performances of fast outswing bowling that I've had the pleasure to see over the years. I figured at any moment that he was going to break down mentally and decide that he was going to bowl an in-swinger or do something different. But for 2 innings, and I think he took 8 wickets in the game, took 5 in the first innings when we bowled South Africa out for about 84, I think. He took 5 for 40 out of that 84, but he got Smith, Amler and Callis in both innings. Yes, as I say, it was one of the most impressive performances of fast outswing bowling that I saw. The emotional toll that I expected that to take of him, let alone the physical toll, I fully expected that he would struggle to back up in the second test match in Durban, but he bowled equally well in the Durban test match. But I doubt that he would have done as well as that had he not prepared as well as he did for those 2 test matches. And so I think it's really important that we acknowledge the importance of the mind and the power of the mind. You know, we spend, as I say, 95% of our day in the subconscious, and probably about 80% of our thoughts are the same as the day before. So, you know, if you're somebody who very easily falls into negative thinking, it's really important that we help these players build these strong mental routines, which are generally on the back of a physical routine. You know, preparing for a game is really important, and as I said before, it starts days out, and the very best players are weeks out, starting to think about the next game that they're playing in, and it's not again about just their primary skill. You know, batsmen obviously think about batting and bowlers think about bowling, but we need players to be thinking about their fielding. And again, the better players do. They think about where they're going to be fielding, what sorts of shots will be hit depending on where they're fielding, what sort of catches they're likely to get, and they start preparing themselves mentally for those sorts of routines and for those catches and for the roles that they're going to play in the field. Probably one of the other examples that I can think of somebody whom I worked with and worked very much with them around these sort of routines was MS Dhoni. I mean, MS was one of the most gifted players that I ever had the good fortune to work with. Very unorthodox. He developed, obviously, playing his cricket in the streets and pick up matches with peers and so on. Often playing, above his age group. He was one of the strongest players. He was a player that could hit a boundary and probably hit a 6 at will better than nearly any other player that I've ever seen. We played a series against Sri Lanka in must have been around, it might have been late 2005 in India. And MS got 180 odd in one game. And I've never seen a batsman take a bowling attack apart like he did and hit so many boundaries and cleared the boundaries so often. But I could see that he got a thrill out of hitting boundaries. And even though he had the ability to hit a boundary almost at will, I felt that he was going to fail to reach his potential unless he learnt to hit the ball on the ground as well and to be able to control the game by hitting the ball on the ground. And I talked to him about this, and I've got to say, the first conversation, I don't think he was overly excited about. he got a thrill. He got a big thrill out of hitting boundaries, and he got an even bigger thrill out of hitting sixes. And I had to convince him that he had to see a way of getting enjoyment out of finishing games properly. And getting in, hitting the ball on the ground, taking as few risks as possible, knowing full well that if he needed to, he could pull out a boundary when it was required. But if he could make sure that he removed most of the risk and didn't give his wicket away, he could become the best finishing player that the game's ever seen. And thankfully, he got a big thrill out of it. He started to see the enjoyment of finishing games. And he knew in the end, as most of the opposition teams knew, was that if he was still there at the end, no matter what the run rate was, India would probably win. And I think the game that I enjoyed most was the one after he got the 184. We played Sri Lanka in, where was it? Just not far from Mumbai. What's the... anyway, it doesn't matter. Pune, yes, exactly. Sorry, we were playing at Pune, which is not an overly big ground. And we didn't have a huge chase, and I think he came in when we needed around about 100 to get. But I had an agreement with him, and he had an agreement with me that he wouldn't hit a six, wouldn't hit a ball in the air until we'd won the game. And he was going along very well, and we were getting close to winning the game. And he called for a glove change, and I think RP Singh was the 12th man, and RP went out, changed the gloves, and he came back and he said, MS wants to know if he can hit the ball in the air now. And I said, no, you just tell him when we won the game, he can hit the ball in the air. Well, we needed four runs to win with about 3 balls to go. And he hit the biggest six I've seen straight down the ground and virtually out of the ground at Pune. And he came off with a big grin on his face and he said, is that all right, coach? And I said, that's fine, MS. But the thing that I enjoyed most was the fact that you took this game deep and you made sure that we finished it off and we were able to win the game. So it's all about the preparation, but it's all about, what's going on in the mind and getting players to see the sort of role that you want them to play and to build strong routines that they can rely on in the games. And the only way they can build those routines is if they're training them. And if we set up the environments in such a way that they're able to train those routines just as much as their ability to hit the ball and bowl the ball. I'm happy to throw it open for any questions at this stage. If anyone would like to just have a general discussion around, mental skills and the way we can train them.
Hi, Greg. This is Monty here.
Yes, Monty. How are you?
Hi. I had a question in regards with creative visualization, just the way you pointed out how you can prepare well by visualizing the innings which you're going to play in upcoming challenges. Yeah. Have you ever recommended someone who has failed in particular couple of innings and to visualize him to correct those innings which he has already played?
Yes, I mean, going back over the innings that they played and particularly the bowlers and getting them to understand what works and what doesn't work. And I think, to be able to go back over those past innings is really important. And the thing that I learned from my own career, but in talking to players, they all agree in the end that 99.9% of the time they've got themselves out through a mental error. Now, that mental error may well have been brought about by some good bowling and some good fielding and the pressure being built up on them. But in the end, it's succumbing to that mental error, succumbing to the frustration or whatever it is that causes a batsman maybe to predict what he's going to do with the next delivery rather than just play it on its merit, or at least keep the odds in their favour. Obviously, when you get into limited over games, 20 games and so on, there's a lot of predicting that goes on. But again, I think the better players keep the odds in their favour. They're not taking risks that are heavily weighted against them. Obviously the game of cricket is a is an exercise in risk management as well. If you want to make runs, you need to play shots. If you want to take wickets, you've got to risk getting hit for 4. But going back over the innings that maybe weren't so successful is a very good way of being able to start to learn what works and what doesn't work for you. And most players that I've worked with, they'll tell you the first time that you ask them that, no, I don't have a routine. But actually, when you dig into it, they do have a routine. They're just not conscious of it. And it's running in the subconscious mind. And some days it happens. Some days it happens 80% of the time. Other days it happens 20% of the time. So there's fluctuations in their fortunes. There is no guarantee if you have a good mental routine that you will succeed every time you play. But if you're preparing properly with your mental routines, you do increase your chances of having success. And the one thing that I learned when I sat down and realized that I did have a routine, but I was only using it spasmodically, that I had to take control of what was going on in my conscious mind. I had to give the conscious mind something to do that it was good at. The conscious mind can deal with about 40 pieces of information every second. The subconscious mind can deal with millions of pieces of information every second. So it's important that we don't try and run the program on the conscious mind because it's too clunky. It can't handle enough information. And if you try and think your way through it, the physical activity, if you'd had to think about when you were standing up to get out of the chair earlier, if you'd had to think about which leg you were going to start with, how you were physically getting out of the chair, you may still be trying to get out of the chair now. Thankfully, we don't learn to talk before we learn to walk. Otherwise, we might need someone might feel they could have to teach us to walk. Again, if we had to teach someone to walk, it might take them forever. But they learn to walk from watching others and trying and failing and trying again. So going back over those good innings and the bad innings can give you a lot of information about what routine works best for you and how for you to manage it so that you're giving the conscious mind a job that it's good at, like watch the ball and play straight, and allow the subconscious mind to pick the ball up out of the hand and react to what happens. And we all know that the best innings you play and the best bowling performances are when you're pretty much controlling the conscious mind and just letting the subconscious mind run the program without any interference. Troy can tell you that, a bowling action will change very drastically between a ball in which you run up with confidence and bowling with some confidence that you know what you're doing, than if you're running up to Virat Kohli, who's just hit you back over your head 3 times and you're wondering what he's going to do the next one. A little bit of tension creeps into the bowling action, and it's very different from the smooth action that you'll have when you're in control of your mental faculties. So reviewing your performances is a great way to learn how to improve that routine.
Thanks, Ray.
Murali, unmute yourself, please.
Yeah, I did. Thanks.
Greg, RX Murali here from Bangalore.
Yes, Murali.
Yeah, Greg, I have 2 things. One is, I just want your view on the first one. The second one is the question. The first one is, I keep talking to my players as cricket is a 10-second game.
Yeah.
Now, 10-second game, which is done over 120 times, becomes T20. And 10-second game, which is done over 300 times, becomes 50, and then into 540 balls a day. So cricket is basically 10 seconds. So I keep asking my players, now you tell me the routine for these 10 seconds. Right? So this is something that I wanted your view on that. And the second one, and the second one is, now that we know that India is going to be traveling to Australia to play 5 test matches, what would your preparation be? What would you tell your openers? What would you tell your middle order batsmen, and what would you tell your bowlers? Now we have
Well,
six.
Yeah, look, I think they're both. I think what you're doing with the 10-second game is very good. I mean, that's the sort of stuff I think most players miss out on. They're not getting that sort of information, so they get caught up with thinking that they've got to concentrate for, say, 2 hours of a session in a first-class game, and you can't concentrate for that long. In fact, the conscious mind can only focus for a few seconds at a time. So again, by breaking it down to 10 seconds is fitting in very much with the way that the conscious mind operates. So, players that go out there and think that they've got to concentrate for the whole time they're out there, they generally get physically tired very quickly, because trying to force yourself to focus for that long actually takes a lot of mental energy, and it wears one out very, very quickly. I've talked to players over the years who they get very tired hands. They get cramps in their hands. They get cramps in their arms. They're trying to concentrate too hard for too long. And so with those players, I've worked back to the 10-second rule with them. So I think that's brilliant, and I think that's something that if every player understood that, they would improve their performances exponentially. There are a lot of players that, as I say, I've played with and I've worked with and played against who have never understood that, and even when discussing it with them, they haven't really been able to find a way to take the tension out of. Because tension comes from anxiety, it comes from fear, wherever it comes from, and it's not that easy to relax if you're tensed up. As for an Indian team, going to Australia, Mohali would be one place I'd want to be taking the team to train. I think in the time that I was there, definitely Mohali was the most consistently hard, bouncy wicket in India. This, the myth that I'd been told that India couldn't produce hard, bouncy wickets is absolutely a myth. I saw a lot of wickets. They were generally practice wickets that were hard and bouncy. Sadly, when it got to game day, the grass was gone and the bounce was gone. If you don't produce wickets with grass, you won't get bounce and you won't get pace. But I saw a lot of wickets, the warm-up wickets where the bowlers bowled on the side of the block were hard and fast and bouncy, and then we played on a wicket that was slow and low. It's all in the preparation, and it's all in whatever the request is for the conditions for the game. But wherever I could find pitches that had pace and bounce, I'd want to be training there for as long as possible, leading into a tour of Australia. Failing that, obviously you've got hard wickets. You can train on hard wickets, but it's not quite the same as getting a turf wicket with a bit of bounce and pace. For those that have been to Australia before, then obviously they can start doing some visualization. They can, reflect back on innings that they've played on, in those conditions before. But ideally, it's getting the conditions that will at least replicate the conditions that you're going to. We tried to get some wickets in at the training ground of the NCA before we went to South Africa back in 2006, because those practice wickets at the NCA, when they had a bit of grass on them, they bounced and they seamed. And with the SG ball, it was quite challenging to bat in those conditions. So if you're not preparing for the conditions that that you're going to, it's obviously going to be hard for players to adjust quickly. The big challenge for players from Australia and England and New Zealand is, going to the subcontinent and adjusting to the ball, and South Africa, of course, adjusting to the ball bouncing less. The real challenge is for those countries where the ball does bounce less, coming to Australia and adjusting up to the bounce is probably the hardest of the lot. I think that extra bounce is more challenging than the less bounce.
So would this one hold good that you prepare to play the length in Australia than the line?
Yes, pretty much. Length is pretty important because our wickets have become more generic. I think over the last 30 years. I know last century when I played, they all had their own distinct personality, and the beauty of it was that there was a variety of surfaces. The whacker has always been fast and bouncy. And every team, even the Australian first-class teams going to Perth, even if you'd played there before, it would take you a day or so to adjust. And by that stage, you'd lost the game. Basically, you'd been bowled out in the first innings and the game was virtually over. Most teams didn't go there far enough in advance of the game to give you 2 or 3 days to adjust to that extra bounce. The Gabba was always pretty bouncy. Adelaide Oval was a good wicket. Early in the game, it would have a bit of pace and bounce for the better fast bowlers. Towards the end, it would spin a bit. Melbourne would be up and down towards day 3 and 4, and Sydney would spin. So if you were making runs and taking wickets in all venues in Australia, the selectors could pick you with confidence that you could go anywhere in the world and be a chance of making runs and taking wickets because you'd done it on a variety of different conditions. None of our pitches, even now at the National Cricket Centre, Troy can tell you, we've got a so-called subcontinental wicket there, which has the same soil content, the same clay content as wickets in parts of India, but it still bounces too much. We can't get a wicket that'll stay down like an Indian wicket does, particularly as the game goes on. That was the fascinating thing with my time in India was, the first 3.5 days of the game would go so slowly because the game seemed to be going nowhere. It'd be your 550 against their 600 and you'd think, well, there's no chance of a result here. And then on the last day and a half, the game would go so quickly. And the Indian players were so good at just hanging in till day 5, day 4.5 to day 5, knowing full well that most touring teams would be exhausted by then and that they would be better at dealing with the pitch in the second innings of a game. It was fascinating to watch. And I don't know that for a visiting team, there's any way to prepare for that other than coming to India and playing a lot of games.
Thank you.
Any question, guys? Or any discussion point? A point of view?
You've always got questions, Kagan.
Greg, just a question here actually is,
Yes,
just wanted to, the Indian season is pretty long in the sense we have Ranji trophies, we have one-dayers, we have T20s, and each player has his own issue about preparing themselves. But an important question came up is to during the season, how do you differentiate between discipline and rigidity when it comes to following routines?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's everyone has a different personality. There's no doubt about it, and I think there is no one size fits all. I think you have to have some flexibility in the way that players prepare. And I think the other thing, one of the most difficult things I had to deal with in my time with India was getting the players to take a day off, to have a rest, because physically and mentally they needed a rest. But, it was a challenge because they spent a lot of time in hotel rooms. And so they wanted to get out, and the only place they could really go was to go to training. But even just to have a light training was mentally draining because you were still at the cricket ground. You were still involved with cricket bats and balls and so on. Look, I think a day off is underestimated, both for a coach and for a player. I've had to, force players to have a day off. I'm not just talking about Indian players, with Australian players as well. And, to convince them that not only should they be having a break, but I needed a break. my value to you is going to diminish if I'm tired and I'm exhausted and I'm frustrated, or just head full of too much stuff. I can't be of help to the group. And so managing that time is really good. And maybe one of the ways to do it is to have some virtual training sessions, where maybe they stay at home or come together as a group, but maybe away from the cricket ground, or at least away from the training ground, and sit quietly and do some visualization. Think about the innings that they've played, or the overs that they've bowled this season. We talked before about the 10-second game. I mean, even for bowlers, one of the things that I had to work very hard with the Indian bowlers on was understanding that it wasn't about running up and bowling magic balls. Every now and then a magic ball will come out, and invariably the magic ball doesn't take wickets. It's often your less than best ball that takes wickets, because all of a sudden a batsman tries to play a shot at something that you've stopped them from doing for a while, and they make a mistake. But to convince bowlers that it's good balls, good overs, good spells is what gets you wickets. Think of your season as one ball at a time, but if you keep bowling good balls and you keep reacting well to each ball, over the season, your performances will back up the fact that you've really disciplined yourself. You've had routines, and you've stuck to the basics of doing your job well. And I think just getting guys to sit quietly and think about their stock ball. Just bowl the stock ball 100 times in your mind. See yourself bowling it perfectly. That's a really powerful training session. And it hasn't taken anything out of them physically. So they've basically got a day off from training, but they've actually had a very powerful training session. So those sort of days, I think, are underestimated.
Yep.
I know I learned as a player that I needed to have a day off reasonably regularly. And I'm not talking about 3 times a week, but once a week I needed to have a day away from the cricket. And I knew when I got physically and particularly mentally tired, for me, the best place to go was the beach. Go and walk in the sand, swim in the salt water. An hour or two at the beach was like a week's holiday. It would just freshen me up mentally. For some people, it might be going to the movies. It might be just going and doing something totally unrelated to cricket. Go and play a game of golf. I remember Ricky Ponting, towards the end of his career, I was a national selector, and we were playing at the Gabba, and Ricky was struggling. And they had on the day before the game, they had a non-compulsory training session. And Ricky turned up and had a batting session. It's the worst batting session I've seen by any player, let alone one of the best players in the world. I don't think he hit a ball anywhere near the middle of the bat. He got so frustrated. He got angry, and, it was a total waste of time. In fact, it was worse than a waste of time. It was very damaging. It was damaging to his mind and his confidence, because he was already struggling for form at that point. And he came out to have a break, to have a drink before he was going to go back in. And I said to him, "Mate, what are you doing here?" And he said, "Oh, I need the training." I said, "No, you don't. You've hit enough balls in your life to know what to do. You'd have been better off going and having a game of golf today and clearing your head, because you with a clear head will be a better player than the bloke that's going to turn up tomorrow after this frustrating training session." So rest days are underestimated, and you've got to factor them into your season and plan for them. Otherwise, they won't happen.
Yeah.
If you think, "Oh, we'll have a day off soon," it'll never happen. You need to plan for them.
Yep. Thanks, Greg.
Yeah, hi, Greg. Just a quick question on preparation. How different your preparation is for the team, or for the opponent, or for the player who is unknown, in respect to the players and teams which are known, or which you've got more information on? How different the preparation is?
Yeah, that's a good question because you know, it happens regularly, obviously, and depending what level you're playing at. You know, at the league level, you could be playing against unknown players regularly, so it does make it difficult. I've always been a believer that worry about what you're doing more than what the opposition are doing. Make sure that your preparation is ideal for what your players need. But if you do have a good idea of the opposition, and you know they might have two left arm seamers, for instance, you know, try and make sure that if you haven't got left arm seamers in your squad, make sure that you can get some bowlers who bowl left arm, so to speak. You know, for example, from a playing, you know, individual player point of view, again, getting back to that visualization. If you know the opposition, you can prepare really well because you can spend hours. And I did spend hours leading up to a game if I knew the opposition, actually seeing myself batting against the bowlers that I was going to be batting against because I'd seen them before. I knew what they bowled. I knew the angles that they would cause. And therefore, you know, I knew when Richard Hadley was bowling, you know, Richard was going to be bowling outswingers. But the errors that Richard made, if he made errors, and there weren't many, but was when, if it was swinging, he would be pitching the ball sort of middle and leg to hit off stump. If it didn't swing, then obviously there were scoring opportunities on the leg side. You know, driving was going to be a big part of any innings that I'd play against him. But again, you know, going back to the earlier question about playing length, you know, when you've got someone like Hadley bowling fast outswingers, you've got to make sure you're driving at the right ones. And again, you can train that in your mind. You know, batting against Andy Roberts, you know, Andy had a really good mixture of deliveries. He would mix up his pace really well. He had a very, very good change of pace, which was a quicker ball, very strong shoulder action, and he could bowl a quicker ball, which he often did with bouncers. He had two bouncers. He'd bowl one that he was quite happy for you to hit for four, because he wanted you to be looking to hit, you know, to hook him. And then he would bowl another bouncer that was 1.5 yards faster and often got you into trouble. So you could prepare well for those that you know. The ones you don't know, I think you can, you know, I would recommend to players to just do a generic session. You know, get a variety, just imagine a variety of bowlers, right arm, left arm, spinners, whatever it is, and just see yourself playing the shots that you would expect to be playing. And it's more than just seeing yourself playing those shots. You've actually got to feel it. You know, you've got to, you know, hear the sound of the bat on the ball. You know, the best feedback as a batsman is the feel and the sound of the ball off the bat. You know, as soon as you've hit it, whether you've hit it well or not. And in those visualization sessions, it was really important to be able to get the emotion, you know, the feeling of hitting a good shot. That goes into the brain really well because the subconscious mind has no idea of the difference between an imagined training session and a real training session. If there's emotion involved in it, that imagined training session is as good as if you'd done it actually. Now, the subconscious's job is to do what the conscious mind tells it. So make sure you're telling it, giving it the right information. The subconscious mind does not accept negative commands. If you say, don't do this, it doesn't register. You know, don't play at balls outside the off stump. That's not a good message to give your brain. All it hears is play at balls outside off stump. You know, you've got to give instructions. I will do this. This is what I want to happen, not what you don't want to happen. And again, most people live their life in fear of what might go wrong rather than thinking about what they want to go right. So those generic training sessions can be very powerful if you don't know who the opposition are.
Thank you.
Yes.
We have probably time for one question or point of view. Somebody wants to share something, you know, I can call upon if Zubin, you are there. You had some very
Oh, yeah. Oh, Greg, that was fascinating. Thanks for that. Really appreciate that. Just wanted to share a few things from the way we sort of think about these things. And one of the thoughts that we sort of like to share is that a lot of these guys talk about rising to the occasion, especially amongst the coaching staff. We sort of, big game coming, final. But actually, exactly to your point, it's actually going down to the level of your training and going down to the level of your practice and having that awareness that actually it's not about rising to the occasion, which most coaches will tell you that, it's a final of a college game or a school game or a Ranji Trophy final or a World Cup final, and everybody's sort of hyped up to this rising to the occasion. But what we noticed amongst, obviously the great players and others, that they're able to go down to the level of their practice and just focus on that. And there are so many examples that I wanted to share linked to what you said, which is, like playing Joel Garner, for example. I remember Sachin having somebody stand on a bed in the room, throw tennis balls at him to sort of replicate the West Indies bounce. Stuff like that. So exactly to your point that, he was just going down to the level of his practice and increasing the intensity of that practice. And I think with to your point in terms of how you practice, I think if bowlers and batsmen, depending on what you're doing, are trying to embarrass each other, and we've seen it, in certain pockets of cricket within Bombay and Mumbai, that a lot of practice sessions were based around, friends, even Sai and myself, for example, trying to embarrass each other while practicing. If he would try and, get me out and give me a send-off, and then I would try and hit him for 6 or whatever. And the level of intensity that we had within those practice sessions was then translated across into the game, where you just went in and thought, okay, this is just another practice session. The other thing I wanted to share was on this sort of there's the lady in chess called Judith Polgar who was mapped. The brain was mapped, and she actually started a career like when she was 4 or 5 years old, and they kept sort of testing her and mapping her brain. And what they found was that, normally chess players play by moves, like 3 or 4 moves ahead or 5 moves ahead. But she actually wasn't playing the move at all. She was playing the pattern on the board. She had seen so many million patterns that she was just functioning on the pattern and not the move. And actually, if you go back to, even just growing up in Mumbai watching Sachin bat, you just notice that intuitive mind of having played millions of balls, he would just play the pattern. And you could see the difference between when he was playing the pattern and he was a genius, to when, the other problems came much later on and he was sort of, trying to play like you said, trying to physically do something. And you could see that he was half the player. And so that was another fascinating example that I thought. And the last one was, the discussion, you touched on it a little bit, between the conscious and the subconscious. And it's like trying to explain to coaches that, like you said, go get the glass of water. At what point does it move from the conscious to the subconscious? I think we need to make batsmen, bowlers, etc., much more aware of when that change happens. And like you said, concentration is, you talked about concentration. Is that conscious? Is that subconscious? And when does that switch over? Because, as we know, the skill per se is the subconscious skill, but you need to be present in that moment to be, concentrating and so on. So that's another fascinating area that I think from a coaching perspective, we need to sort of broaden our horizons to sort of explain that point a little better to coaches who sort of, and then obviously to the player to understand when does the conscious mind sort of have to let go and then, move into the subconscious. So those were just a few things that I wanted to share.
Thanks, Zubin. They were all really, really good. I agree with you about the training sessions. I can be grateful that I had a teammate like Dennis Lilly and Ashley Mallett in particular were very competitive, and some of the best training sessions that I had was with those blokes bowling like they bowled in the game, and me trying to react to what they were bowling like I did in the game. So the better teams tend to have the better practice sessions, generally speaking. and generally they're fairly competitive. Look, this is a subject that you could talk about for weeks and still have plenty left to talk about. But you're right, Zubin. Just understanding, which part of the brain has what job, and resting it, giving the subconscious a bit of a break, and particularly give the conscious mind a bit of a break between balls is really important. So they're all, as I said before, we know the better players do this better than everybody else, but by and large, we don't talk about it enough, and we certainly don't set up our training sessions in a way to get the best results. Because
I think that explanation that you made about, I don't think that that sort of skill that you perform in a match happens at that moment. Like you said, it happens way before, 6 months before it's actually already gone through your mind. Yeah. And then the skill actually just happens, it just happens because you've already thought through how you played, Garner, or as you said, you went through the whole thing in your mind. And actually that's when you played them. You then eventually, the physical aspect just happened naturally. You just let it happen. And the skill was performed, 6 months before. I think that if we get that across, more and more, I think we'll definitely take the level of the game higher and higher through coaching and, what we do.
Well, I think this is the new frontier for cricket. I don't think we've really taken on this aspect of the game enough from a coaching point of view. It's been much easier for us to stand at the end of a net session and divide the batsmen up into time slots and bowlers here and bowlers there. That for a lot of coaches, that pretty much is the extent of what they do around a training session. I think there's so much for us to understand around the power of the mind and how to leverage that power of the mind to take players to a new level and to take coaches to a new level. To be fair, I think we can all go to a different level the more we understand about this stuff. And there's so much more information now. I mean, when I first started looking for this sort of information, you had to go into libraries and find magazines or go and watch a movie of some sort. But now with the internet, you've only got to dial in the power of the mind, and you'll get hundreds of options of information that you can look up. So those of you that haven't done it, I would recommend that you find some information. YouTube has many clips of people talking about how the mind works and how to use the mind better. So if you're looking for information, it's available to you on YouTube, just at the click of a button.
Great. Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
Woody here.
Hey, Woody.
Hello, mate. I was lucky enough to play with David Gower in my years at Hampshire. And one thing I learned off him was, I know he was a very laid-back character, but as the game got closer, he practiced less.
Yes.
So what I mean by that is he was he sort of took me under his wing for the first couple of years, which was brilliant. And so I was 18 years old. I just wanted to have nets and bat and bat and bat and bat. And he'd go in and bat. He'd bat for, say, 2 minutes. And if he's hitting the ball well, he'd come out. Yeah. And he came down to me in a net, and I was hitting the ball well. And he came down and said, and we were playing the next day. He said, "Why are you batting now?" And I said, "Well, I'm feeling good." And he said, "Well, yeah, but it doesn't matter if you score 100 here. You want to score 100 tomorrow." So he was one of those that if he was hitting the ball well, he'd stop. But if he wasn't hitting the ball well, he'd obviously keep going and going and going until he was hitting the ball well. So one thing I learned from him, and I see a lot of young players, they just bat for the sake of batting before a game. So if they're playing well, I try and get them to almost stop because they've got to play the next day and they're hitting well. If that makes sense.
Oh, mate, it makes a lot of sense. I think that's probably he's given you one of the best lessons that you were ever going to get. I see, and I'm not talking about just young players here. I see a lot of international players who hit balls for the sake of hitting balls, and they bat themselves out of form. They start the session and they're hitting the ball well, And then they go out of that net and they go and have a throw, a sidearm session on top of that, or a bowling machine, and by the end of it, they're out of form.
Yeah,
and the other thing that go back to Guggen's little bit of trivia at the start, where the different bat swing against the bowling machine, the sidearm, and the bowler. I don't know why players bat against bowling machines and sidearms, particularly the day before a game, because they're actually training a different rhythm, totally different timing mechanism from the one that they'll have on a game day. So they go from batting against a bowler to an hour of sidearms, and they've actually detrained themselves.
No, I get that.
Ricky Ponting was, in the height of his career, he didn't hit many balls during games, between games. If he was hitting the ball well, he'd walk out of the net. Sadly, towards the end of his career, he started hitting a lot of balls because he wasn't hitting them so well, and so he hit more and more balls. And he actually left a legacy of guys hitting a lot of balls when, in fact, in the prime of his career, he didn't hit many balls at all.
Yeah, interesting.
A fresh mind is much better than an overtrained body, I can tell you. And training at a low intensity is dangerous.
Yeah.
The beauty with the timing of our career was that we didn't get many training sessions in a week. And they didn't go, they only went for a couple of hours. So you got in there, you did what you had to do at high intensity, and you got out of there. And players actually got better doing that. I'm seeing players training more now and not getting better because they're training at low intensity for long periods. If you train at for long periods at low intensity, you actually detrain yourself. You get into bad habits mentally as much as physically. You're better off, going back to Sai's question earlier, the short, sharp, high intense sessions, get out of there. No, Stop while you're hitting them well or bowling well, rather than go on until you're out of form.
Yeah. I find the young players, the good ones, know when to stop.
Yeah.
And the ones who aren't so good, just keep doing it until the coach says stop.
Yeah.
No.
That's a little bit of fear too.
Exactly. I was about to say, Greg, on that fear part, what we noticed about guys who wanted to play the wanger and the bowling machine more than the actual bowlers, there was a huge element of ego and fear, trying to, almost like getting out to that particular bowler. They didn't want to get out to any sort of net bowler. And that fear drove them to sort of move towards this wanger or bowling machine, so that it just didn't feel like they were getting out. It was fascinating to watch how and these are, guys who are playing test cricket, how that sort of transformed their sort of mind, and we had to sort of almost reprogram the guy to, boss, you need to get back into that net and get out a few times to actually rewire the thinking. So I think that wanger thing comes from a lot of fear, that they almost don't want to get out in the real world. And that actually then, has a further impact down the line.
Yeah, no doubt.
Fascinating. Guys,
Greg, I've got one quick question, if that's all right.
Yes,
it's Mo here.
Yeah, hi, Mo.
How you doing, mate? You all right?
Yeah, good as well. Thank you.
Just a quick one, really. So we've talked quite a lot about players there. What's your thoughts on the most important mental skills for coaches and leaders in a high-performance environment? And I don't know, from your experience, any routines or tricks that you developed that you thought helped keep you fresh, keep you focused? I know you talked about rest earlier, but was anything else more specific, particularly at the really sharp end? And you've held jobs as tough as any, particularly coaching job in India with a senior team, which is obviously high pressure.
Yeah, look, I think trying to get as much variety within with the training sessions, so being prepared, understanding the group, and understanding. Look, I think the best thing you can do from a coaching point of view is start from the end. What is it that you're trying to achieve, whether it's for this training session or with the way that you want the team to play? Start from the end and work back. So, okay, this is what we want to achieve. How do we get there? Then you've got the steps that will take you to that, hopefully to that goal. So I think having at least in your own mind, you've got to understand where it is that you're trying to take this player or this group, and then get them to buy into that plan, if at all possible. It doesn't always work, and sometimes you've got to go back 2 steps and start again with some players. But I really think is having much like the player, having a strong idea of where you're trying to get to is really important, and then mixing things up a bit. If the training sessions become repetitive, then there's not much growth going to be going on in that group. And I know there are a lot of reasons why you do some repetitive stuff, but where possible, the more variety, the more fun that you can have. I judge a training session on the amount of noise that's going on. If the players Zubin was talking before about bowlers challenging batsmen and batsmen trying to fight back. Having I got you out, no, I hit it, that was 4. The more competitive the training session is, the more noise you'll have around it, because there will be emotion going on and there will be a bit of noise. So, I think if I'm not enjoying it as a coach, they're probably not enjoying it either. So it's really trying to keep that environment as creative as possible. I mean, what sort of things do you think, Mo?
Yeah, well, I think all of that resonates, definitely. I just wondered, I guess coaching and leading is a little bit like playing in the coaches and leaders are riddled with self-doubt at times. You second guess yourself. You can not think enough and you can overthink. It's a microcosm of it, I guess, but it's just a different context because you're not stepping out and going into the middle and taking guard, are you?
But sometimes that's harder.
Same thought processes, yeah.
Yeah, look, I think you've made a good point there. I mean, one of the things that I learned was to manage your emotions as a coach, not to get too involved in the outcome, in the results. If you're only worried about wins and losses, you'll make a lot of short-term decisions that won't necessarily be in the best interest of anyone. So I think, again, it's a bit like I was talking about before. If the bowlers can understand that it's good balls, good overs, good spells, and batsmen that it's one ball at a time, and how what you've got to get good at is how well you react to the balls that are bowled. I think it's also important for a coach to understand that if you're only going by the results, it's very short-term thinking that will lead to a very short-term tenure. I think you've got to take a longer-term view of it and be able to ride the highs and the lows. I can remember sitting in the dressing room when I was coaching South Australia years ago, and Tim Nielsen was my assistant coach, and it was the last day of a game at Adelaide Oval against New South Wales, and it was a very tense game, and it was just before lunch. And I felt very tense. And I looked over and I sort of saw Tim Nielsen sitting a few seats along from me, biting his fingernails. And I said to him, mate, we've got to relax. These blokes are coming back in here in a minute. And if they see us like this, that won't help them. So we started telling each other jokes so that by the time the players came in, we were laughing and, a lot more relaxed than we were beforehand. I think if you can train yourself not to be riding the emotions each day, each game, you'll be more used to your players because you'll make better decisions because you're not reacting from an emotional level. You're reacting from a rational level.
Yeah, makes sense.
Guys,
in addition to what Greg said, I think the upwards management aspect is becoming more and more important in terms of the franchise owners and things like that. We've got other challenges like that people in those positions face. And I think how you manage them becomes quite a critical aspect of how it then reflects on the team. There are examples all the way through where, for example, the owner wants to win a particular game and qualify, but everybody does. but sometimes if you're in a position where you feel that this is not in the longer term interest of the player and the team, and that's when you have to take that call. And I think we need better understanding of those situations and better management of that whole process. And I think that's where the modern game is going. And I think we're all in this together. So understanding that whole spectrum better is, I think, beneficial to sort of all parties if we're sort of wanting to improve as coaches at that level.
Yeah, I think you're right, Zubin. And having those key decision makers at the top aware of what Greg mentioned at the start, your long-term vision, what you're aiming towards, so that they also they don't go two up and two down, as Greg mentioned. We see a lot of that in Premier League football over here, where it's so short-termism with football coaches and managers. There's a lot of pressure from owners, which is probably the same kind of thing, that unless the coach or manager has a vehicle or mechanism to manage the financial decision makers, then it's real trouble.
Yeah, totally.
I think head coaching is definitely head coaching. It's a pretty lonely island, isn't it, GC? So you've got to understand that you need a break, just like you tell your players you need a break. You need to have a switch off mechanism. You need to go and do something different. And if you don't have that in your routine, you are going to be mindful, and that's going to be disastrous, as you said. But definitely, it's a lonely place, head coaches. I think we're all sitting in the same room. We all know that the pressures you're going to be under, but you really need to have a process where you can switch off. If it's good enough for us as coaches to tell our players they need to switch off, I think we need to have a process too. So make sure that you have some way of taking a break. And I think that way you'll actually regenerate yourself, charge your batteries up, and come back, and be a better resource for your players.
And the nature has.
I think it's simpler that way. You give the credit of success to the owner, and when you fail, it's your fault. If you keep that in your mind, you'll be very successful.
And guys, nature has forced this break anyways on us, so I think you can maximize this break. Guys, I think it's nothing but a privilege to have this. I mean, to this discussion, hear this discussion, it was fascinating. Greg, thank you so much, and others, everybody, and so many of you gave some very interesting perspective. By the way, Greg has kindly accepted my request that this whole thing of power of mind should be passed on to players across the globe. And he, along with us, have prepared a 4-day curriculum for this. It's interesting, and with a lot of case studies, typical MBA style, where you have to reflect, come back with homework, and so on and so forth. So let's see how that pans out. We'll share the details with you if you want to share with your colleagues and players. We will share those details. Second, Mo has again kindly accepted to be our next guest speaker on 15th. I think 2015, when England in Australia went out of World Cup pretty early, there was a transformation journey. The brand of cricket which English cricket has played over the last few years is fascinating to watch. I think they have changed, especially the one-day game, definitely. And I think beginning the World Cup, before the World Cup to 2019, there was one team which was probably deserving to win, objectively speaking, was England. So I think it will be fascinating to hear from Mo what triggered the transformation. I think we know the trigger, but how they went about it, it will be fascinating to hear. So Mo, we're looking forward to that. It will be next Friday. And guys, again, we'll make it as interactive as this was, and we'll get the best out of it.
Thanks, Gagan. Thanks, guys. Look forward to it, Mo.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks,
Cheers,
guys.
well done.
Thank you so much, Greg.
Well done.
Cheers, guys. Thanks, Greg.
Cheers, boys.
Enjoy your weekend.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
See you guys.
Thank you very much.